Tonight, a sports scientist who worked with Oscar Pistorius describes how the sportsman overcame his broken body and triumphed as an athlete.
Arms out, crossing the finishing line and competing in able-bodied competition represents his triumph over his disability.
And the prosecution tries to discredit his evidence in fierce cross-examination.
Now, those experiences with Mr. Pistorius, that would be character evidence and not expert evidence.
Welcome to the High Court in Pretoria, where we've heard in great detail from a sports scientist who worked with Oscar Pistorius for 6 years. Professor Wayne Derman described what it's like living with prosthetic legs, emphasising that disability never sleeps. He also spoke of the two Oscars, the athlete who could take on the able-bodied with a never-say-die attitude, but also the vulnerable disabled man who admitted he would be stuffed without his prosthesis. Professor Derman's report was seized on by prosecutor Harry Nell, who accused the witness of giving contradictory statements and questioned his expertise. Sky's Paul Harrison reports.
Arriving by car, adjusting the trousers over his prosthetic legs. A subconscious yet poignant action by Oscar Pistorius, who took his seat in court to hear his colleague and sports scientist tell Judge Masipa not having lower legs was the source of the Paralympian's daily vulnerability.
Although Mr. Pistorius has dedicated his life to fight against discrimination against disability, and he loathes to be pitied in any way, the hard truth is that he does not have lower legs. We don't really understand it. And I'm including myself in that. And I'm saying that I don't think even that I'm the best person to try and explain this to you, because I do not have something called a lived experience. I am not disabled. I don't have a lived experience of disability. And in order to truly understand it, you need a lived experience of disability. You've got a paradox of an individual who is supremely able, and you've got an individual who is significantly disabled. And that template of him with his arms out, crossing the finishing line and competing in able-bodied competition represents his triumph over his disability. And that template is what he holds up, to perform against each and every day when you are without your stumps, without your prostheses. One also assumes that that is the only time that you are vulnerable. That doesn't impact on issues to do when you have got your prostheses on. My lady, that is not true. Disability impacts nearly every aspect of one's life.
Through the words of amputees themselves, Professor Derman then sought to highlight the daily hurdles faced by all those who've lost limbs.
You get stared at constantly, loss of confidence or self-esteem. Self-image, often poor, self-conscious, a lifetime issue. Staring has a detrimental effect on those of us. People sometimes feel uncomfortable for us. People ask questions. People make judgments on your disability before they know you. They're slow to make friends. Often you're excluded. Social issues in communal bathroom showers, ashamed of never being able to shower in public. Opening bottles of shampoo, shower gel, because you have to have one hand on a handrail all the time in order to balance. Difficulty getting dressed. Prosthetic legs are bulky. It takes much more time to put these on. There's a bad odor of the legs, which makes for embarrassment. This is a problem on a plane, sharing room with somebody, etc. There are many issues to do with intimacy that I don't feel that this is the forum to actually go into, but you can imagine personal, intimate relationships. In the home, generally, on the couch without prosthetic legs, for example, one is not able to reach a cell phone quickly for answering if not next to you. While sleeping, it takes effort to go to the bathroom, to have a shower before putting on the prosthetic legs has to be done every time because of hygiene. Not able to react quickly to anything. You have a sense of fear in the house, etc. Not able to protect oneself or spouse when something happens extreme vulnerability without prosthetic legs. For the postman or delivery, etc., it takes a long time to open the door. Not comfortable hosting anyone for coffee, not even friends, when without prosthetic legs. It has a knock-on effect through one's entire function. And the saddest thing that I have learnt, my lady, in my experience of now 6 years working with athletes with disability, is that disability never sleeps. It's there when you go to sleep at night, and it's there when you wake up in the morning.
Defending Oscar Pistorius, Kenny Aldridge quoted from the psychologist's report, pointing to the two Oscars, one being the never say die confident superstar, the other the man measuring less than 1.5 metres in height who felt stuffed without his prosthetic legs.
Quote, using his body in space to run and jump and climb gave him a sense of confidence in his physical abilities and probably partially rehabilitated his view of, quote, me as a broken body, unquote. And then I turn to deal with the contents of page 28, headlines 22 to 23. I believe the construction of, quote, the two Oscars, unquote, I referred to earlier, finally gelled into a final split. The one Oscar being an international superstar, more confident and feeling more in control at 1.84 meters tall, that part of him falling back on his physicality and, quote, never say die, unquote, attitude that had served him so well. Although not completely at ease, he felt less vulnerable in that state. The other Oscar being a vulnerable and fearful disabled person at less than 1.5 meters, once his prostheses were removed and he was alone at night. That part of him falling back onto his anxiety and fear, not feeling in control. With his prosthesis on, many people can damage him, but without them, he feels defenseless. Quote, I am stuffed without my legs on, unquote.
The trial of Oscar Pistorius may have begun 4 months ago today, but in that time the legal team's often direct approach has far from softened, as prosecutor Harry Nell showed as he attempted to discredit the so-called expert witness.
If I listened to what you said my brief was to share my experiences with Mr. Pistorius. Now, those experiences with Mr. Pistorius, that would be character evidence and not expert evidence.
No, because it's in relevance, my knowledge of him, with respect to any of my knowledge in disabilities or the fact that I am a sport and exercise medicine physician who has knowledge of the other responses that might be in play here.
Your main responsibility is to act in the best interest of your client or your patient. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
Is that what you're doing now?
I believe so.
Now, wouldn't you say that an expert witness would require a high sense of objectivity to be able to assist the court in any way?
Indeed, I would, sir.
But that you don't have, because objectivity may harm your client, your patient.
I'm not going to come before this court giving and I understand Mr. Nell's inference is one of bias, a biased report, because I have been very, very careful, my lady, to back up with scientific evidence all the points that I have made. I would not risk my reputation being here by coming to bring bias and a biased report.
One cannot do this. To suggest to Professor Derman that he's here only to serve his patient's best interests by virtue of the doctor-patient relationship. What Mr. Nell should have done, so as to prevent a misunderstanding or a misleading statement, is to have said to Professor Derman, in a medical context, insofar as the relationship between patient and doctor goes, you must serve your client's best interests at all times. That we understand to be the code of good practice governing physicians and their patients, not in the context of him having to serve his client's best interests here in court today. It's a misleading statement.
The objection is sustained.
As a good please.
Thank you, my lady.
Coming up, prosecutor Harry Nell puts pressure on Pistorius' response to the startle. Welcome back. This morning, a sports scientist described how there were two sides to Oscar Pistorius and the impact of living with a disability. He then faced a harder line of questioning over his relationship with Mr. Pistorius.
Mr. Pistorius, in this particular instance, is more than a patient of yours. Am I right in saying that?
I'm uncertain what you mean by that.
Do you think he's more of a patient? Is he just a patient like all your other patients? Are you closer to him? Have you had more contact with him than you will have with a normal patient? Patient, not
No.
athlete. Not.
My lady, not at all. There are a group of athletes in Cape Town, that in Stellenbosch, a group of Paralympians that I spend much more time with than I've spent with Mr. Pistorius, and indeed are closer to in my working relationship than Mr. Pistorius. So Mr. Nell is incorrect.
But what we have is, you've described your relationship. You've known him for 6 years. That's number one. Two, you've got to know him by virtue of periodical health assessments. That's number. My lady, it's paragraph 16, page 4. I've marked them. Number 3, you had direct observations of your patient during medical consultations, both formal and informal, number 4, as well as my observation of him within the close confines of us residing together, that's 5. As in a team, number 6, as in the second paragraph, I've spent significant amount of time with Mr. Pistorius in the anti-doping, and you made it clear that at paragraph 15, I have an intimate knowledge of my patient, Mr. Pistorius. So the person you're giving evidence about, you have an intimate knowledge of and a direct relationship.
I would also say that there are a number of other athletes that I have also learnt about. And I don't want to use their names, but the more successful an athlete is, the more you're going to learn about them, because you're going to accompanying them into the anti-doping environment.
Dr. Derman said he'd spoken to Pistorius on 2 occasions about what happened on February the 14th last year because he wanted to hear it for himself. But his recording of these events came under scrutiny.
My lady, I have explained to Mr. Nell that there were 2 occasions that I met with Mr. Pistorius, and this here, how it is recorded, the events of the 14th of February is how I recollect, and I understood the events to be exactly when I wrote this. I don't have those.
You see,
I'm
again,
sorry.
the question was just easy. I asked you when you said, it must have been before. Now I'm asking the question, it must have been before what?
Before I met with him the second time.
You wrote this down before you met with him a second time. Are you sure?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
You see, that is my problem. You're this expert. You want to guide the court. You don't take notes. You're not quite sure. An expert can't give that answer, Professor. You must be quite sure.
Well, So this is how I understand it. This is my recollection of the two occasions that, if there is something specific that you disagree with in this, then I welcome your question on it.
No, please, Professor, I will direct questions as I would like to. Sir, can you not tell us when you recorded 46 and 47? Before the trial started or thereafter?
It must be when the trial had started.
Okay. It must have been when the trial had started, so that means it must have been a week before Mr. Pistorius was sent for observation.
No, sir, that's not true. I've discussed with you that this has been over a long period of time.
Confusion seemed to reign over how many audible startles or noises there were, with the witness being accused of contradicting himself.
And please, if you don't understand, address it to the court. I'm dealing with a contradiction in your evidence. That's all. A contradiction in saying, I would have expected a second startle. Followed up right now by saying, I can't say. Why would you have those two contradictory answers in a question of an hour?
My lady, I don't believe that those answers were contradictory. Mr. Nell put it to me that if there was one startle and that culminated in all of the events that ended up in the shooting, would that be outside the flight and fright response? That's how I understood that question to be put to me, and the answer is I don't know. I can't say that would be, because you would need to measure. You would need to measure the sympathetic nervous system at that time.
But initially you said you would require a second or a subsequent startle because of the lapse of time, and I want you to explain that.
Because there were two further noises which were the startles.
No, sir. I'm not dealing with the two further. And you cannot get away from this, Professor. You yourself said you would expect a second startle, and that's all I'm asking you. Why did you say that initially?
My lady, because there was a second startle.
No, you see, Professor, as an expert, that question is interesting. You yourself clarified the fact that you were referring to the other two startles. Remember, you said, I now understand, I must forget about that. Am I right? I must not take that into account. Am I right?
My lady, Mr. Nell has got me very confused. I am really sticking by what I have said here about the fact that there were two other startle responses, and that's what I was referring to. And I'm sorry, I can't assist further.
Unfortunately, Professor, it's not that easy.
Today we've been given an insight into the psychological and physical challenges of wearing prosthetics by the last witness in this trial, sports scientist Professor Wayne Derman. Dr. Derman, who worked with Oscar Pistorius for 6 years, described himself as an expert witness, a definition prosecutor Harry Nell tried to discredit. Well, to discuss today's evidence, I'm joined by the psychologist Sonia Jordan and the criminal attorney Ait Motlung. Thank you both. Sonia, first of all, we heard a lot from the professor about this fight or flight response, particularly in terms of a disabled person. The suggestion is that it was the fight response that kicked in, that Oscar Pistorius chose to go towards the danger.
It is possible, but you know what? It's also, you must also remember that you act on stuff that is known to you. He was used to act when he ran, to listen for the shot. So that was his response. His first response, probably. I've never speak to him, so I can't say that. But I know that is a very normal response, especially for athletes.
What about this issue of trying to show that there was a reason for Oscar Pistorius going towards the danger? It's an important issue for the defence, isn't it?
Look, the truth of the matter is that it all leaves me cold. I'll tell you why. There are two reasons. One, You see, when you call expert witnesses, you call them so that they can support your case. In other words, Oscar should have made out the case first, which they must then come and support. They can't make out the case for him. Now the question is, what's Oscar's case? It started off as a putative self-defense. It mutated into automatism. It had subtle inferences of mental illness. The question is, what's his case? You can call all experts of the world, but they must support your case. They can't make out the case for you.
So you're saying that this witness is to shore up their case very late in the trial?
Let me tell you why the evidence of Professor Derman in particular has left me cold. That fight or flight thing, I think in his own words, is not an exact science. Okay? and Oscar has not testified about the fight or flight mode. So whose case are they putting up? So, and in criminal proceedings, you can't pull out the rabbit out of the hat right at the end. If it was their case, then by the time the state closed its case, after about, is it 20 witnesses that the state called? Then that fight or flight mode should have been put to one of those witnesses as a reason or explanation for his conduct.
So, Sonia, even if they raise this fight or flight,
Yes.
they can't prove that that was prompting his actions?
No, they can't, because they don't know what his thoughts were. But it is not exact science, I fully agree. But, you know, out of many years of working with people like this, you know there is that instant moment of freeze. And if there was a shot or a thought or anything, that was the point of fighting.
But
Even if it was if he thought that Riva was in difficult, that could be a very, very, for me, valuable point.
Well, thank you both for your insights. As we know, the trial is still continuing. The court won't sit tomorrow. The cross-examination of Professor Wayne Derman will continue instead on Monday. You can prepare for that by watching our roundup of this week's defence case with a special programme at the weekend. For now, though, goodbye from Pretoria.